Luna Elara Vane returned to Blackthorn with blood beneath her cloak, rain tangled in her hair, and a silver box pressed against her ribs. Inside were 2 shoes she had bought after the physician told her that, after 8 years of waiting, she was carrying Kael's child. Through 14 hours of storm, Elara imagined placing the box in his hands before dawn and watching the Alpha King disappear beneath the man she had married. Instead, she entered the war hall and saw Celine Armand sitting in the Luna's chair, while Kael stood beside her with Elara's command seal. The hall grew quiet enough for Elara to hear rain against the windows. Men who had followed her through 3 winters lowered their eyes because they understood what Kael had decided. Celine lifted her chin while Kael fastened the silver chain around her throat, and Elara watched the seal settle against another woman's chest. 8 years earlier, he had placed that same seal around Elara's neck and promised that no rival house would ever take her place beside him. Tonight, he broke that promise without speaking, while Elara tightened her grip around the silver box until its edge bit into her palm. Elara spread a blood-stained map across the table and showed Kael the passage beneath Eastern Gate and the route Vargan could use to enter Blackthorn. Kael noticed blood beneath her shoulder, and concern moved through his eyes. Elara hated how quickly her heart answered, because part of her still wanted him to step around the table and ask who had hurt her. Celine ended that hope by laying forged letters over the map, each carrying Elara's seal, and claiming she had promised Eastern Vale its soldiers could withdraw when battle began. Kael's face hardened, and 8 years of loyalty became a question. She asked him to search her chambers, question every messenger, and strip every command, but leave the 4th Legion at Eastern Gate. Celine extended one hand toward the Luna command seal, and Elara asked Kael to keep it or give it to General Theron, but not place it on the woman lingering beside him after councils ended. Kael hesitated, and hope rose inside Elara before she could stop it. Then he lowered the seal into Celine's palm. She remembered Kael once silencing men who laughed at a young Luna studying maps, and tonight she watched him give that place away. Less than an hour later, Elara found Quartermaster Rowan dead behind the Western Armory, with half a ledger page clenched in his hand. The entries showed royal gold moving through merchants tied to House Armand. Someone was cutting Blackthorn open from within. She should have disappeared, yet love had not died quickly enough to make that choice easy. Kael had humiliated her, but the thought of him marching into the trap remained unbearable. So she carried the ledger and silver box toward the royal bedchamber, determined to give Kael one final chance to hear the truth. The door stood partly open. Celine's gown lay on the floor, Kael's coat beside it, and Celine sat on Elara's side of the bed, wearing the silver robe Kael had given his wife after their 5th winter. Kael stood beside the bed with his shirt open, and Elara stopped so sharply that the box slipped from her hands. One tiny shoe rolled across the stone and rested beside Kael's boot. That morning, Elara had held the same shoe and laughed because it looked impossibly small, wondering whether their child would inherit Kael's gray eyes. Now that future lay between his boot and another woman's feet. Celine placed one hand against Kael's chest and left it there, turning silence into a choice, while Elara stood in the doorway and hated herself for hoping. Kael could have removed the hand, crossed the room, asked why Elara was bleeding, looked at the shoe, or spoken her name with tenderness to keep their marriage alive. He did none of it. Elara bent, gathered the shoe, wiped dust from its edge, and returned it to the box without telling him what it meant. She had crossed a battlefield to bring that secret, but he had every chance to ask and chose not to. When Elara turned toward the corridor, Kael followed to the doorway, and she slowed because 8 years of love had taught her the sound of his footsteps too well. What came instead was the heavy door moving behind her. Elara looked back through the narrowing space and found Kael standing with one hand against the wood, his eyes fixed on tears she had refused before the council. He hesitated, and Elara gave him that heartbeat because some promises take longer to die than the people who made them. Then Kael closed the door, leaving Elara alone with the silver box against her stomach. Minutes later, the Western Armory exploded, 6 soldiers died, and a false Luna seal was found beneath the wreckage. Kael ordered Elara confined, and near midnight men wearing Blackthorn armor came to transfer her, only to turn their blades on her beyond the walls. Elara escaped the carriage into the forest, but pain twisted across her abdomen and drove her to her knees. When she saw blood on her dress, every humiliation became smaller than the fear inside her. She pressed both hands over her stomach and forced herself upright as torches moved closer between the trees. Eastern Vale waited beyond the mountains, the homeland she had left because she had chosen Kael, and now she ran toward it because someone else had to come first. Back in Blackthorn, Selene placed Elara's Luna ring into Kael's palm and told him his wife had killed her guards and fled east. While Bloodfang warriors moved through the tunnel Elara had begged him to seal. Miles away, Elara removed the symbol binding her to Blackthorn, and at that moment pain tore through Kael's chest as the bond between Alpha and Luna began to break. The first warhorn had barely finished echoing across Blackthorn when Kael's knees struck the stone before thousands of soldiers. One moment he had been standing beneath the black banners of House Draven with Elara's Luna ring closed inside his fist, preparing to lead the army west. The next, something tightened around his heart with such violence that the world narrowed to a single white flash of pain. His breath vanished, his fingers opened, and the ring fell beside him with a thin metallic sound that seemed absurdly small beneath the sudden roar of voices. Men rushed forward, but Kael heard none of them clearly, because another sensation had already begun beneath his skin, burning across the place where the mate mark rested over his chest. He dragged one hand beneath his armor and found the mark hot enough to make his palm recoil. When Elder Meron tore open the collar of his battle tunic, the silver lines that had connected Kael to Elara for 8 years were fading toward gray. Kael tried to stand before anyone could see fear on his face, but the bond tightened again and forced him back down. Elder Meron pressed 2 fingers against the mark, then looked toward the eastern horizon with an expression Kael had never seen on him. "She is alive," the old man said, and Kael's head snapped toward him so quickly that pain shot through his neck. Relief came first, sharp and shameful, because some part of him had spent the last hour imagining Elara lying dead beneath the trees. Then Meron continued, explaining that the Luna bond was weakening because Elara had begun severing her oath to Blackthorn, an ancient act no bonded Luna undertook, unless remaining tied to her king had become more dangerous than leaving him. Kael looked down at the ring beside his knee and remembered the way Elara had stood outside their chamber while he closed the door. And for the first time he wondered whether the pain in his chest was not punishment from the bond, but merely an echo of what he had already done to her. Selene arrived before that thought could deepen, carrying a blood-stained report from the Northern Patrol. Her voice was controlled, but Kael noticed how quickly she placed the parchment into his hand, as though urgency could prevent him from thinking about anything else. The report claimed Elara had crossed toward Eastern Vale after killing 2 guards during her escape. Selene reminded the council that the forged letters had mentioned the same territory, and several commanders immediately began speaking over one another, demanding that the eastern roads be sealed before Elara could rally House Vane against Blackthorn. Kael stared at the page without reading the final lines. He could still see the tiny silver shoe beside his boot from the night before, although he had never understood what it meant, and he could still see Elara looking back through the narrowing doorway while he chose pride over one step toward her. Yet, around him stood an army waiting for orders, and kings were rarely given the luxury of doubt once thousands of men had begun moving. Kael signed the command to bring Elara back alive. The ink had not dried before the eastern moon gate refused to open. At first, Kael thought it was a mechanical failure. Then the gate captain arrived with a pale face and a sealed message from the eastern lords. No soldiers would pass through, no grain convoy would enter Blackthorn, and no eastern healer would cross the border until the accusations against Elara were withdrawn and her status was clarified. Kael crushed the message in one hand. For 8 years, the eastern banners had appeared whenever Blackthorn called, and he had allowed himself to believe that loyalty belonged to the crown. General Theron finally told him what no one had dared say the night before. The Eastern Alliance had never belonged to Kael. It belonged to Elara, because House Vane had controlled those lands long before her marriage, and because the lords there trusted her word more than any order written beneath the Draven seal. That truth unsettled Kael more than open rebellion would have. He remembered Elara sitting through council meetings long after midnight, translating old Eastern treaties he had never bothered to read, negotiating grain prices, repairing blood feuds between clans whose names Kael barely remembered. He had called those matters tedious. Elara had never complained. He had thought the alliance strong because he was Alpha King. Now, with one woman gone, half the structure beneath his throne had begun to disappear before sunrise. Selene immediately argued that this proved Elara had prepared the eastern withdrawal in advance, but Theron turned on her with a coldness that silenced the hall. "Or it proves," he said, "that we mistook the Luna's work for the king's power." Kael said nothing, because there were truths too humiliating to challenge when they arrived at the exact moment consequences began. The first casualty report came before noon. Bloodfang had attacked Eastern Passage. Kael read the location twice, as though the letters might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. The 4th Legion had already been moved west under Celine's strategy, leaving fewer than 600 men to guard the mines. Elara's warning returned with cruel precision. If you move them, Vargan can enter Blackthorn beneath the walls. Kael ordered the Legion back, but distance had already become an enemy. By the time reinforcements reached the eastern line, smoke could be seen rising above the hills. Wounded soldiers staggered through the gate, carrying men who had left the palace only hours earlier, laughing about returning before supper. One of them had no left arm. Another was young enough that Kael remembered approving his first commission less than a month ago. Neither looked at their king when they were carried past him. General Theron found Commander Aldrin near the collapsed entrance to the mining passage. The old commander had served Kael's father before serving him, and had once carried Kael from a battlefield when he was 16. Now he lay against the stone, with blood soaking his armor and one hand still gripping a broken spear. Kael knelt beside him, but Aldrin's eyes moved past the king toward the eastern ridge, as though he were searching for someone who was not there. Kael promised the healers were coming. Aldrin gave a faint, almost tired smile. Your Luna already told us where they would come from. Kael's mouth tightened. Aldrin coughed, and blood touched his teeth. She stood in that hall bleeding, and we let another woman call her a liar. Kael tried to silence him, not from anger, but because each word seemed to reach somewhere the mate bond had already torn open. Aldrin died before the healers arrived. For several minutes, Kael remained kneeling beside the body while soldiers moved around him. He remembered ordering Elara from the council after she warned him. He remembered how she had looked at the map before leaving, not angry enough for a traitor, only exhausted enough for someone who already knew she would not be believed. What unsettled him most was that he had begun revisiting every moment from the night before and finding a different meaning inside it. The blood on her cloak had not been evidence of secret travel. It had come from the Eastern Front. Her refusal to surrender the troop position had not been defiance. It had been desperation. Even the way she protected the silver box suddenly felt important, though he still could not explain why. Celine appeared at the field command tent before Kael returned to the palace. She brought another report, this one claiming patrols had spotted a lone rider resembling Elara near the northern ridge. Kael ordered trackers sent immediately, but Celine pressed harder, arguing that Elara should be publicly declared a traitor before the Eastern Lords could rally behind her. Kael looked at Celine for a long moment and noticed something he had ignored the night before. She was wearing the Luna Command seal above her armor. The silver looked wrong against her throat. He could still remember the faint scratch along its edge from Hollow Ridge, a mark Elara had once joked gave the seal more character. Celine touched it while speaking, unaware that Kael's gaze had settled there. For the first time, he wondered why she had wanted it so badly. That evening, the answer began to emerge. A Bloodfang courier was captured near the Eastern River, carrying a copy of Blackthorn's latest troop deployment. The parchment showed every adjustment made after Elara had been removed from command, including the 4th Legion's transfer west. Kael read the report slowly, then asked exactly who had been present when the revised plan was approved. General Theron named the 5 men in the room, then paused before adding one more name. Selina Armand. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the previous night. This time, nobody lowered their eyes for Elara. They looked at Celine. Kael felt something cold settle beneath the pain in his chest. He asked when the plan had been copied. The courier had received it shortly before dawn, hours after Elara had been confined, and before she escaped Blackthorn. Celine immediately argued that Elara could have had an accomplice inside the palace, but Kael barely heard her. For the first time, the accusation against his wife encountered something stronger than suspicion: impossibility. Elara could not have stolen a plan she had never seen. Kael turned toward Theron. Bring me every document seized from her chambers, every letter, every seal record, every witness who touched those orders. Celine's face changed only slightly, but Kael saw it. The same small tension Elara had noticed in the war hall. Fear. Far beyond Blackthorn, Elara woke beneath a stone roof in Eastern Vale, with bandages around her shoulder and both hands resting over her stomach. She remembered running, the blood on her dress, the torches behind her, and Kael's hand closing the bedroom door. Her first attempt to rise failed. An old healer caught her before she fell and forced her back onto the bed. Elara did not ask where she was or how long she had been unconscious. She asked only one question. The healer placed a hand over hers and told her the child was still alive. Elara closed her eyes, and the breath she released trembled more than any tears she had refused before Kael. Back in Blackthorn, Kael stood alone in the war hall after midnight with Elara's Luna ring in one hand and the captured Bloodfang deployment plan in the other. Her empty chair remained beside the table. Selene had left hours earlier. For the first time, Kael did not look at that chair and see a place waiting to be filled. He saw the woman he had removed from it. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the war, beneath the pain of the weakening bond, a far more dangerous thought finally took shape. Elara may never have betrayed him at all. If that was true, then every humiliation she had suffered the night before had not been justice. It had been his choice. Kael did not sleep that night, because once doubt entered the place where certainty had stood, every memory from the previous 24 hours returned with a different face, and each one was harder to endure than the last. He remained alone in the war hall long after the commanders had gone, staring at the empty Luna's chair while Elara's ring lay beside the captured Bloodfang deployment plan, and he found himself remembering details he had dismissed when anger still protected him from thinking too deeply. He remembered the blood on her cloak when she entered the council, the way she had asked him to investigate everything except the Eastern Defense, and the quiet desperation beneath her voice when she begged him not to give her command seal to Selene. At the time, Kael had heard only defiance, because wounded pride had made every word from Elara sound like resistance. Now he heard something else, something he should have recognized before the kingdom began bleeding for his mistake, and the realization settled heavily in him that Elara had not been fighting to protect herself that night. She had been fighting to protect Blackthorn, even while Blackthorn stood ready to condemn her. Before dawn, Kael summoned the Keeper of Royal Seals, the master scribe responsible for every mark used by the crown, and ordered him brought through a private entrance so Selene would not know an investigation had begun. The old man arrived shaking so badly that he could barely hold the ledger Kael placed before him, yet fear eventually proved weaker than the king's demand for truth. After several minutes of silence, the scribe admitted that a duplicate Luna seal had been created 3 months earlier, under threat from men carrying the Black Falcon of House Armand. They had taken measurements from an older ceremonial seal and paid him enough gold to disappear afterward, but he had remained because his daughter was still inside Blackthorn. Kael listened without interrupting, although every word seemed to push the same blade deeper. The forged letters, the weapons convoy, the seal beneath the ruined armory, all of it had been possible because someone had prepared Elara's guilt long before the eve of war, which meant the woman he had humiliated before the council had walked into a trap so complete that even her attempts to defend herself had been turned against her. Kael asked whether Selene herself had given the order, and the scribe hesitated before answering that he had never spoken directly to her, but every payment had passed through a steward belonging to House Armand. That was enough to turn suspicion into something colder, though Kael refused to move too quickly, while 3,000 Armand soldiers remained inside Blackthorn's walls. He ordered General Theron to quietly replace the guards at the Western Armory, place trusted men near every gate, and watch Selene's movements without allowing her to realize she was being watched. Theron obeyed, but before leaving, he looked at Kael in a way that carried no triumph, only exhaustion, and reminded him that Elara had asked for this investigation before anyone died. Kael said nothing, because there was no defense for that truth, and because the man standing before him had already buried Commander Aldrin for believing the king's decision over the Luna's warning. Later that morning, an elderly maid named Mara arrived outside the war hall carrying a silver box wrapped in Elara's torn cloak. She had found it in the corridor near the royal bedchamber after the chaos of the armory explosion. But when Elara was imprisoned, Mara had hidden it because Selene's servants were searching through everything belonging to the Luna. Kael recognized the box immediately, and the memory struck before Mara even placed it in his hands. He saw Elara standing at the bedroom door while Selene's hand rested against his chest. Then he saw the box slipping from Elara's fingers and one tiny silver object rolling near his boot. He had noticed movement that night, but anger had kept his eyes on his wife's face because some cruel part of him had wanted her to see that he would not be the one to cross the room first. Kael had believed he was refusing to yield to a woman who might have betrayed him. Now, with the box resting in his hands, he could no longer hide from the possibility that his pride had turned him into the only traitor in that room. He opened the lid slowly and found the ledger fragments first, then the map Elara had marked with the location of the eastern tunnel. Every warning written in her own hand beside positions, Bloodfang had already used exactly as she predicted. Beneath those documents rested a small square of white cloth, and when Kael lifted it, 2 silver baby shoes appeared side by side. For several seconds, he did not understand what he was looking at because the truth arrived more slowly than fear. And then his fingers went still around the edge of the box. One shoe bore a tiny crescent carved into the heel, matching the symbol Elara wore on the ring he still carried. The other had a black wolf carved beside it, the mark of House Draven. Between them lay a folded note in Elara's handwriting, written before the night had turned against her, when she had still believed she was walking toward her husband with good news instead of entering the room where he would break her. Kael unfolded the note and read the words once, then again, because the first reading refused to settle into something his mind could accept. Elara had written that she wanted him to return alive because someone was waiting to meet his father, and beneath the sentence she had drawn a tiny crooked wolf, the kind of foolish mark she used only in letters meant for him rather than the crown. Kael stared at the shoes until the war hall blurred around him. The image of that night returned with unbearable clarity, but now every detail carried a meaning he had been too blind to see. Elara had not carried evidence alone when she came to him. She had carried the first gift for their child. The small object beside his boot had not been jewelry or some keepsake. It had been the future they had waited 8 years to touch, and while it lay at his feet, he had stood beside Celine and allowed Elara to pick it up alone. The memory of Elara wiping dust from the tiny shoe became impossible to escape, because Kael could finally understand why her hands had trembled, and why something in her face had changed before she closed the box. She had been looking at more than a husband with another woman. She had been looking at the father of her unborn child, choosing not to cross the room. Kael sat down slowly in the chair beside the war table, not because his body failed him, but because standing beneath that truth suddenly felt dishonest. He remembered how long Elara had wanted a child, though she rarely spoke of it after the early years, and he remembered the nights when court whispers followed her through the palace, because the Luna had not yet produced an heir. Elara had endured those whispers without asking him to silence them, and when Kael once promised they could stop trying if the pain became too much, she had smiled and told him she already had a life worth protecting beside him. Now he understood that she had finally received the thing she had stopped asking the world for, and he had turned that night into the moment she learned she might have to protect it without him. Theron returned to find Kael still holding the note, and the general's expression changed when he saw the shoes. Kael asked where Elara had been found after the attack, but Theron had no answer, because the soldiers involved in the transfer had either died or disappeared, and the few bodies recovered near the burned carriage belonged mostly to men later identified as Armand retainers. That discovery made the room colder. The order Kael had signed was clear. Elara was to be brought back alive. Yet someone had replaced the escort, moved her outside the safest road, and surrounded the transfer with soldiers loyal to Celine's house. Kael immediately demanded the original command records, and within an hour the truth became worse. His order had been copied, altered, and resealed after leaving the council chamber, changing the instruction from peaceful transfer to lethal force if Elara resisted. The forgery carried the same duplicate seal already tied to House Armand. Kael's anger finally broke through the grief, but even rage offered no comfort because every new proof returned him to the same conclusion. Celine had built the trap, but Kael had repeatedly opened the doors for her. He had believed the letters, removed Elara from command, given Celine the seal, refused Elara's warning, allowed her confinement, and signed the transfer order that placed her within reach of the men trying to kill her. Celine had manipulated the pieces, yet Kael had moved himself exactly where she needed him. He ordered Celine placed under quiet surveillance and sent trusted riders toward Eastern Vale with instructions to find Elara before anyone from House Armand reached her. But the command felt painfully late. He was finally doing everything Elara had needed from him the night before, only after she was gone. Far beyond Blackthorn, Elara woke in a stone chamber beneath the crest of House Vane, with sunlight moving across the floor and an old healer sitting beside her bed. For several moments Elara did not recognize the room, though the carved silver branches above the window belonged to a childhood she had not seen in years. Memory returned in fragments, beginning with the burning carriage, then the arrow, the blood on her dress, and finally Kael's hand closing the bedroom door while Celine remained behind him in Elara's robe. Her hand moved instinctively toward her stomach, and the healer immediately covered it with her own, before telling Elara that the child had survived the bleeding and that the heartbeat remained strong. Elara closed her eyes as relief moved through her body so violently that tears escaped before she could stop them. Yet she did not wipe them away, because no council stood before her now, and no one here needed Luna Elara to remain unbroken. The healer warned that Elara had lost too much blood and could not ride for several days, but messengers were already arriving from Blackthorn with news of the eastern attack and the losses caused by the abandoned passage. Elara listened without satisfaction, because being proven right meant nothing when men she had commanded were dead. She asked first about Commander Aldrin, and the silence that followed answered before anyone spoke. Elara turned her face toward the window, where the mountains rose beneath morning light, and remembered Aldrin placing a cloak around her shoulders after her first winter battle, because Kael had been too injured to leave the healer's tent. The thought that Aldrin had died holding the position she begged Kael not to abandon brought a different grief than the one Celine had caused. It was cleaner, heavier, and without anger, because Aldrin had paid for a mistake that belonged to people still alive. By evening, the Lord Regents of Eastern Vale gathered around Elara's bed and urged her to sever every tie to Blackthorn immediately, arguing that Kael had publicly disgraced House Vane and then allowed an attempt on the life of its heir. Elara listened until they finished, then asked for the latest reports from the border instead of answering. She learned that Bloodfang scouts were moving more freely near Blackthorn, that Armand soldiers had begun repositioning inside the capital, and that several eastern caravans had been turned back after refusing orders signed under Celine's temporary seal. Elara recognized the pattern because it matched Rowan's ledger and the false troop movements. Celine was not merely protecting herself anymore. She was preparing something larger, and the fact that Kael had begun investigating would only make the next move more dangerous. At Blackthorn, Kael reached the same conclusion when Theron reported that 2 Armand companies had abandoned their assigned barracks without permission and moved toward the western gate under the excuse of reinforcing the walls. Celine had also dismissed several Blackthorn officers from the inner guard and replaced them with men loyal to her house. Kael immediately ordered the changes reversed, but before the command could reach the gate, the first alarm bell sounded from the western tower. A second bell followed from beneath the old mining quarter, then a third from inside the palace itself. Kael looked toward Theron, and neither man needed the report that came moments later, because smoke was already rising beyond the courtyard, while armed Armand soldiers appeared on the inner walls. Celine had moved first. The western gate began to open from inside. At the same time, explosions shook the abandoned mining passage beneath Eastern Gate, destroying the barriers Blackthorn had placed there after the first attack, and from the darkness below came the unmistakable roar of Bloodfang warriors entering the city. Kael ran toward the armory as soldiers flooded the corridors, but before he reached the stairs, one of Celine's personal guards blocked the passage with a drawn blade and announced that House Armand no longer recognized Kael's authority, while Blackthorn remained under the influence of a traitorous Luna. The words were almost absurd enough to make Kael laugh, because Celine was now using the accusation against Elara to justify the betrayal. Elara had spent the entire previous night trying to prevent. Kael killed the guard and reached the courtyard as Blackthorn began tearing itself apart from within. Armand banners appeared above the western wall, Bloodfang horns sounded beneath the city, and soldiers who had prepared to fight an enemy beyond the gates suddenly found blades coming from men who had eaten beside them only hours earlier. Through the chaos, Kael saw the shape of Celine on the upper balcony, wearing Elara's Luna command seal over black armor, and in that instant every remaining uncertainty disappeared. Celine had never wanted his affection as much as she wanted access, authority, and the place beside the throne from which Elara had kept Blackthorn united. Kael looked down at the silver baby shoe still tucked inside his coat, where he had placed it before leaving the war hall, and the contrast was almost unbearable. Somewhere beyond the mountains was a wife he had driven away, and a child he had nearly helped Celine kill, while inside Blackthorn, the woman he had chosen over Elara was opening his kingdom to the enemy. For the first time, Kael understood the full shape of the trap, and the truth carried no mercy, because Celine had not defeated Elara herself. She had made Kael distrust Elara, humiliate Elara, remove Elara, and finally send Elara into the hands of assassins, turning the Alpha King into the most useful weapon against the one person who had never stopped protecting him. Beyond the burning western wall, Bloodfang poured into Blackthorn, while far away in Eastern Vale, Elara stood for the first time since waking and demanded her armor, despite the healer's protests, because the smoke rising beyond the mountains had already become visible against the evening sky. She rested one hand over the child beneath her heart, then looked toward the homeland she had once left for Kael and the kingdom that had tried to bury her as a traitor. Elara had every reason to let Blackthorn fall, and every person in the chamber expected her to choose exactly that. Yet the people trapped behind those walls had not closed the bedroom door on her, had not forged her seal, and had not sent assassins after her unborn child. Their lives did not belong to Kael's mistakes, and whatever remained between husband and wife could wait until the innocent were safe. Blackthorn began to burn before sunset, and by the time Kael reached the western courtyard, the kingdom he had believed impossible to break was already dividing itself into pieces beneath different banners. Armand's soldiers controlled the inner wall, Bloodfang warriors were climbing from the reopened mining passage, and the remaining Blackthorn troops were trapped between enemies outside the gates and traitors who had slept beside them only hours earlier. Kael fought through the courtyard with blood running beneath his armor, but every corridor he crossed returned another warning Elara had given him the night before. She had warned him about the tunnel, and Bloodfang had entered through it. She had warned him about House Armand, and their soldiers now held the western tower. She had begged him not to remove the 4th Legion, and the eastern defense had collapsed before noon. Each consequence had arrived exactly where Elara had pointed, and Kael understood with increasing horror that his kingdom was not falling because she had betrayed him, but because he had chosen not to believe the only person who had seen the attack coming. Selene appeared on the upper balcony above the courtyard, wearing black battle armor, and Alara's Luna command seal across her chest, while beneath her House Armand soldiers lowered the Blackthorn banner and raised their own. Kael looked at the silver seal and remembered fastening it around Selene's throat while Elara stood bleeding before the council, then remembered the tiny shoe rolling toward his boot while he remained beside the wrong woman. He had spent the previous night believing that Elara's silence concealed treason, but now Selene's smile told him what that silence had actually concealed: exhaustion, humiliation, and a final attempt to save him despite both. Kael raised his sword toward the balcony, but Selene did not retreat because she no longer needed his affection or approval. She had already taken what she wanted from him, beginning with his trust and ending with the gates of his kingdom. The battle drove Kael backward toward the Great Hall, where General Theron had gathered the remaining loyal soldiers and several hundred civilians seeking shelter from the fighting. Men Kael had known since childhood stood bleeding beneath broken banners, and among them were young recruits who had never seen war before that morning. One boy was holding pressure against his brother's stomach while asking a healer whether the wound could be closed, and Kael recognized both brothers from the ceremony in which they had sworn loyalty less than 6 weeks earlier. The healer did not answer. Kael looked away because the sight carried a cruelty no enemy sword could match. These men had trusted his judgment. Elara had warned him before any of them died. He had dismissed her because believing Selene had protected his pride more easily than admitting he might be wrong. General Theron ordered the doors barred, but before the final beam was lowered, a wounded messenger stumbled inside carrying news that the Western District had fallen, and Vargan himself had entered Blackthorn. The messenger collapsed before finishing the report. Kael knelt beside him and recognized another familiar face, one of Elara's Eastern scouts, who had remained loyal after she was stripped of command. The man's fingers closed weakly around Kael's wrist, and he managed to say that the Luna had been right about everything before his grip loosened. Kael remained beside the body for one moment longer than the battle allowed, because those words had become the sentence Blackthorn kept repeating to him through the mouths of dying men. Elara had been right, yet truth had arrived too late to protect anyone who had depended on him to hear it. The doors finally broke near dusk. Bloodfang warriors entered first, followed by Armand's soldiers who knew every corridor and defense point because Kael himself had allowed them inside the capital as allies. The fighting moved into the Great Hall beneath the carved wolves of House Draven, turning the place where kings had been crowned into a field of broken shields and blood. Kael fought beside Theron until a spear entered beneath his ribs and drove him to one knee. He broke the shaft and kept moving, but strength was beginning to leave him, and the wounded mate bond turned every breath into another struggle. When Theron was struck down near the throne, Kael dragged him behind a pillar, then turned to find the remaining loyal soldiers surrounded. Vargan entered through the shattered doors without hurry. Beside him walked Selene. For one strange moment, Kael barely noticed the Bloodfang leader because his eyes had fixed on the pale silver seal resting against Selene's armor. It had belonged to Elara for 8 years. Selene had worn it less than one day, yet hundreds were already dead beneath its false authority. Vargan looked around the ruined hall with the satisfaction of a man entering a house someone else had unlocked for him, then thanked Celine loudly enough for the surviving counselors to hear. Kael felt anger rise, but Celine only smiled and reminded him that none of this would have been possible while Elara remained beside his throne. Celine had never needed Kael to love her, because love was too fragile a tool for the kind of victory she wanted. She needed him offended, suspicious, proud, and desperate enough to protect his authority that he would mistake the woman defending him for the woman threatening him. House Vane had blocked House Armand from controlling Eastern Vale for generations, and Elara's marriage to Kael had made that influence even stronger. As long as Elara remained Luna, Celine could never control the Eastern routes, the grain alliances, or the old houses whose loyalty followed Vane blood before Draven commands. So, Celine had not tried to defeat Elara before the council. She had simply built lies convincing enough that Kael would do the damage himself, and every time he was given a chance to stop, pride had carried him one step farther. Kael listened without defending himself, because there was no defense left. Then Celine made the mistake of looking toward Vargan as though they were equals. Vargan laughed. The sound moved through the ruined hall more coldly than shouting would have, and Celine's confidence shifted for the first time. He told her that House Armand had been useful because its soldiers knew the gates, its merchants knew the supply roads, and its daughter knew how to make an Alpha King destroy his own alliance. But a woman willing to sell one kingdom for a crown could sell another just as easily. Celine's face hardened as Bloodfang soldiers closed around her. She reminded Vargan of his promise that she would rule Blackthorn once Kael was removed, but Vargan answered that promises made to traitors were merely tools used until the gate opened. Kael almost laughed, despite the blood in his mouth, because the cruelty was perfectly shaped. Celine had spent months convincing him that Elara was preparing to abandon Blackthorn, only to discover that the man she trusted had always intended to abandon her the moment she stopped being useful. Yet there was no satisfaction in it, because the kingdom still burned, and Elara was still somewhere beyond the mountains carrying a child Kael had not known existed when he allowed assassins to hunt her. Celine might finally be learning what betrayal felt like, but Kael had already taught that lesson to the wrong woman first. Vargan ordered Kael disarmed and dragged toward the throne. The Bloodfang leader intended to make the surviving council witness Blackthorn's surrender before nightfall, then execute the Draven commanders at dawn. Celine was forced to her knees beside the dais, still wearing Elara's command seal, while Kael stood wounded before the throne that had belonged to his family for generations. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, he looked at that seat and felt no attachment to it. A crown had once seemed worth every sacrifice because he believed protecting the kingdom justified whatever cruelty duty demanded. Now men lay dead across the floor. His wife had been hunted from her home. His unborn child had nearly died, and the throne remained exactly where it had always been, cold and incapable of forgiving anything done in its name. Then a horn sounded beyond the eastern walls. No one in the hall moved. A second horn followed, deeper than the first, carrying across the burning city with a tone Kael remembered from years earlier when Eastern Vale had formally joined Blackthorn's alliance. Vargan turned toward the broken windows. Celine went pale. Another horn answered from the hills, then another, until the sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Men began shouting outside, first from the eastern wall and then from the courtyard below. Bloodfang guards moved toward the windows, and Kael saw silver banners rising beyond the smoke. The eastern moon gate had opened. House Vane had come to Blackthorn. The first wave of eastern riders struck Bloodfang positions outside the wall. While Vane infantry entered through the gate, Elara alone had authority to open. Their attack came with brutal precision because they knew the eastern routes better than Vargan's men ever could, cutting off the tunnel exits and forcing Bloodfang soldiers away from the civilian districts. Kael heard the battle changing before he saw who led them, because the shouting outside shifted from panic to something that sounded almost like disbelief. The surviving Blackthorn soldiers began looking toward the doors as a new command moved through the courtyard, clear enough to silence even the wounded. Then Elara entered the great hall. She was pale from blood loss, and a dark bandage disappeared beneath the shoulder of her silver armor, but she walked without assistance. House Vane's crest rested across her breastplate instead of the Draven moon she had worn for 8 years, and the absence of Kael's symbols struck him harder than their presence ever had. Her hair was braided away from her face, her mother's dagger rested at one hip, and beneath the fitted armor, the first slight curve of pregnancy was visible to anyone who knew where to look. Kael knew. Everything in the hall disappeared around that single detail. He had imagined Elara dead beneath the trees. He had imagined the child gone before he had ever known it. Now both stood before him. His hand moved without permission, then stopped halfway between his body and hers, because the distance separating them was no longer measured in steps. Elara's eyes passed over him, taking in the wound beneath his ribs and the blood along his armor, but she did not run toward him. She looked first at the civilians behind the pillars, then at Theron on the floor, then at the blood-fanged soldiers holding the hall. The woman who had once crossed rooms the moment Kael was hurt had returned, but she had not returned as his wife. Vargan ordered his guards to seize her. They never reached her. Eastern soldiers poured through the shattered doors behind Elara, while Blackthorn's surviving warriors rose at the sight of the Luna they had been told was a traitor. General Theron, barely conscious, dragged himself upright and shouted for every loyal soldier to follow House Vane's formation. The battle exploded across the hall again, but now Bloodfang had enemies at both ends. Kael recovered his sword from a fallen guard and fought toward Elara, not because he believed she needed saving, but because, for the first time in his life, he wanted to stand where she chose to stand, instead of demanding that she stand beside him. Selene broke free during the confusion. She tore Elara's command seal from her own neck and ran toward the side passage leading to the mining tunnels, hoping to reach the horses outside the eastern quarter. Elara saw her leave and followed, though the healer's warning still lived in every careful movement of her body. Kael followed several steps behind. They reached the lower corridor just as Selene discovered the tunnel exit blocked by Vane's soldiers. She turned, trapped between the woman she had tried to erase and the king she had manipulated. Selene's eyes moved to Elara's stomach. Something desperate entered her face. She drew a hidden blade. Kael saw the direction of the strike before Elara did. He crossed the space between them and caught Selene's wrist hard enough to force the dagger from her hand, then pushed her to the ground as Vane's soldiers surrounded them. Selene looked up at him with disbelief, as though some part of her still expected the man who had chosen her once to make the same choice again. Kael stared down at her and thought of the bedroom door, the silver shoe, and Elara running through the forest with assassins behind her. There would be no second choice. Selena was taken alive. By midnight, Vargan had been captured near the western tower, and the remaining Bloodfang forces began surrendering after the tunnels were sealed from both ends. Blackthorn had survived, though survival looked different when smoke covered half the city and bodies filled the courtyards. Elara remained with the healers, directing food and shelter toward displaced families before allowing anyone to treat the wound that had reopened beneath her armor. Kael watched her from across the courtyard and recognized the same woman who had spent 8 years keeping his kingdom together, while he mistook her work for something that happened naturally around his throne. When the last major fighting ended, Kael finally approached. Elara turned before he spoke. His gaze fell toward her stomach, then returned to her face. There were 1,000 things he needed to say, but every apology sounded too small beside what she had survived. He wanted to ask about the child, to ask whether she was safe, to tell her he had found the shoes, but none of those words could change the night he had refused to cross the room. Elara inclined her head with perfect formality. "Alpha King," she said. There was no anger in the title, and that frightened Kael more than hatred would have. For 8 years, she had called him Kael whenever they were alone, even after their worst arguments. Tonight, surrounded by the ruins she had returned to save, Elara gave him only the name belonging to his crown. Kael understood then that Blackthorn had survived the war. His marriage had not. The Great Hall of Blackthorn was opened again 3 days after the battle, although no one entering it could pretend the kingdom had returned to what it had been before the war, because smoke still clung to the western towers. The courtyard stones carried dark stains that rain had not yet washed away, and too many seats beneath the council banners remained empty. Kael stood before the throne without wearing his crown, while Elara sat across the hall beneath the silver crest of House Vane, no longer in the Luna's chair, and no longer wearing anything that belonged to Blackthorn. Between them stood Selene Armand in chains, stripped of the command seal she had worn so proudly, while Vargan remained under guard beside the council's steps. Every family that had lost someone during the invasion had been permitted to send a witness, and when Selene looked around the hall, she finally saw the faces behind the numbers she had once treated as pieces on a board. The evidence was presented slowly, because Kael refused to allow a single accusation to be hidden beneath his authority. The Keeper of Seals testified first, describing how House Armand had forced him to create a duplicate Luna seal months before the war. The quartermaster's ledger followed, proving that military gold had been redirected through Armand merchants, while Elara's name was placed over the missing shipments. Then came the forged letters, the false weapons convoy, the altered transfer order, and the testimony of the surviving guard who had watched Armand's soldiers turn their blades against Elara beyond the palace walls. Vargan confirmed the final pieces without hesitation, explaining that Celine had promised to break Blackthorn's Eastern Alliance, remove Elara from command, and open the inner routes. Once Kael's suspicion had done the work no invading army could accomplish from outside. With every confession, the story of Elara's supposed treason collapsed until nothing remained except the truth everyone should have seen before the first soldier died. Celine listened until the final witness stepped down, then looked toward Kael, as though some part of her still believed the man who had once allowed her into his bed would protect her from the consequences of everything that followed. She reminded him that he had trusted her, that he had placed Elara's seal around her neck with his own hands, and that every choice she made afterward had been possible only because he had opened the door first. The accusation was meant to wound him, but Kael did not reject it. He looked toward the families gathered beneath the banners and admitted that Celine had lied, manipulated, forged, and betrayed, yet none of that erased the fact that he had chosen pride each time truth asked him to stop. No one had forced him to humiliate Elara before the council. No one had forced him to place another woman in the Luna's chair, and no one had forced him to close the bedroom door while his wife stood outside carrying his child. The hall remained still, while Kael ordered House Armand stripped of military authority, its lands placed under temporary council control, and every asset tied to the conspiracy seized for the families of those killed during the invasion. Celine's title was removed before the court, followed by her inheritance rights and the black falcon brooch she had worn since childhood. When the guards reached for the pale silver cloak draped over her shoulders, Celine tightened her fingers around it instinctively, because it was the last object she possessed that resembled the rank she had wanted so desperately. Elara recognized the fabric immediately as one of the ceremonial cloaks Celine had taken from her chambers after the arrest. For a moment their eyes met, and Celine seemed to expect hatred, perhaps even satisfaction. But Elara gave her neither. The absence of emotion was worse, because Celine had spent months trying to become important enough to destroy Elara and now stood before the woman whose life she had shattered without being able to command even her anger. The guards led Celine from the Great Hall through the same eastern corridor Elara had crossed alone on the night of the betrayal, and the symmetry was not lost on anyone who had been present then. Elara had walked that passage carrying a silver box against her unborn child while commanders whispered behind her, whereas Celine now crossed it between armed guards as the families of dead soldiers watched in silence. She turned once toward Kael, perhaps expecting the hesitation he had shown every time she stood against Elara before, but there was none left. The doors closed behind her, and with that quiet sound, the woman who had spent the entire story stealing pieces of another woman's life disappeared from the palace without the title, seal, army, or king she had believed would make the theft permanent. When the hall settled again, Kael stepped down from the throne and ordered the herald to read a second decree, this one restoring Elara's name before every allied house and formally acknowledging that House Vane had never betrayed Blackthorn. He returned the Eastern Territories to full self-rule, canceled the emergency powers granted over them during the war, and acknowledged publicly that the alliance had survived for years because Elara had maintained it, not because Blackthorn possessed any natural claim over those people. Several counselors expected the ceremony to end there, yet Kael removed the crown from the table beside him and placed it on the stone between himself and Elara. The gesture unsettled the room, because kings rarely lowered anything connected to their authority unless surrender was involved. But Kael was not surrendering Blackthorn. He was removing the shield he had hidden behind whenever he wanted duty to excuse cruelty. Kael told Elara that he had found the silver box, read the note, and understood too late why the tiny shoe had been lying beside his boot while he remained beside Celine. He did not ask Elara to forget that night, because forgetting would have required her to erase too much of herself, and he did not claim that being deceived excused what he had done, because the lie had only created the opportunity while his own choices had completed the betrayal. He asked her to return as Luna, not because the council needed her, not because Eastern Vale strengthened the throne, and not because the child she carried could secure succession, but because he finally understood how much of his life had rested upon a woman he had allowed himself to believe would never leave, regardless of how deeply he wounded her. Elara listened without interrupting, And when Kael finished, she looked at the crown resting between them rather than at his face. There had been a time when that crown represented the life she believed they were building together, and she had carried its weight through famine, war, council hostility, and years of being whispered about because no heir had come. She had once believed love meant enduring whatever arrived beside the person she had chosen, but the night Kael closed the bedroom door had taught her something harsher and more valuable, because love without trust could become another room in which one person waited while the other kept deciding how much pain was acceptable. Elara told Kael that she forgave him because she refused to let hatred become the final bond between them, yet forgiveness did not reopen a door that had closed for a reason, and the fact that he regretted losing her did not mean she was required to become the woman who stayed. Kael lowered his eyes, and Elara continued before he could turn the moment into another plea. Their child would know him, because she would not punish an innocent life for the failures of its parents, and Kael would be allowed to prove what kind of father he wished to become through patience, protection, and consistency, rather than through bloodline alone. However, Elara would not return to the royal bedchamber, would not wear the Luna seal again, and would not allow the child to become a chain binding her back to a marriage whose trust had died before the war even began. Kael accepted the words without argument, although the way his hand tightened beside the crown revealed the cost more clearly than any apology could have done. Before the council dispersed, Elder Meron brought forward a sealed document taken from the oldest archive beneath Eastern Vale, a treaty signed generations earlier between House Draven and House Vane when Blackthorn had first been formed. The document revealed that the two houses had not begun as ruler and subject, but as equal founders whose bloodlines were meant to balance one another, and that no future heir of Blackthorn could claim uncontested recognition from the Eastern Territories without the approval of House Vane. The child Elara carried would therefore become the first descendant in centuries to possess direct blood from both founding lines, which meant the future of the kingdom might one day depend not on Kael's crown alone, but on the child of the woman he had once believed needed his throne more than he needed her loyalty. Months later, when the walls had been repaired and winter had softened into spring, Elara returned to Blackthorn for the signing of a permanent peace treaty between the Eastern Territories and the Crown. She no longer entered through the private Luna's gate and no longer walked several steps behind Kael during formal ceremonies, because House Vane now stood beside House Draven as an equal power. Their child had been born healthy, and Kael had begun traveling east whenever Elara permitted him, not as a king arriving to claim an heir, but as a father learning how to hold a sleeping infant without waking it. The first time Elara saw him cradle the child beneath the same gray eyes she had once imagined when buying the silver shoes, something inside her softened, but it did not become what it had been before. After the treaty was signed, Elara crossed the corridor where Kael had once closed the bedroom door behind her, and for a moment both of them remembered the same night without needing to speak. Kael did not reach for her, because he had finally learned that remorse did not create entitlement, and Elara did not hurry away, because healing no longer required escape. She simply continued toward the carriage waiting beneath the eastern banners while Kael remained behind, a king who had survived invasion, rebellion, and the near collapse of his throne, only to discover that the greatest thing he had lost could not be conquered back by force. If Elara's choice felt like strength rather than cruelty, and if you believe forgiveness should never require a woman to return to the place where her dignity was broken, stay with stories like this and tell me in the comments whether Kael deserved another chance at love or only the chance to become a better father. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not when the betrayer loses everything, but when the person he wounded finally stops measuring her future by whether he regrets the past, because Elara left Blackthorn once with blood on her dress and fear in her heart. Yet she returned with her name restored, her child protected, and a life that no longer depended on being chosen by the man who had once failed to choose her.